Hi everyone and welcome to SciDance Podcast Season 3. I'm your host, Jasmine Cook. This is a dance science podcast presenting discussions with global industry leaders, aiming to make research and information more accessible and enhance dancer wellbeing, health and training at all levels of the sector. New episodes every Monday, 6 a.m. London time. Hi everyone and welcome back to SciDance. I'm here today with Catherine, who is a dancer and dance science researcher from Los Angeles in California, although she's now in Amsterdam. Is that right, Catherine?
Yes, at the moment in Amsterdam.
Yeah, she graduated from Barnard College of Columbia University in New York City with her bachelor's in both dance and physics. During her undergraduate studies, she studied abroad at the Dance Conservatory in the Victorian College of the Arts at the University of Melbourne in Australia. So she's been all over. After finishing her bachelor's, Catherine moved to Switzerland to pursue a combination of her passions of dance and science. At the Institute of Sports Science in the University of Bern, Catherine completed both a Master of Science in Sports Science Research and a Master of Advanced Studies in Dance Science. And following her studies, Catherine then put theory to practice in her own dancing in Amsterdam. So throughout and after her studies, Catherine's been working as a researcher in dance science at the University of Bern, analysing postural stability during rotation, with a particular focus on the influence of a stabilising head coordination, so spotting, on balance, which is what we're going to talk about today. And through her work in Switzerland, Catherine also works at, or throughout your work in Switzerland, you also work at Edith Cowan University in Perth, looking again at biomechanics and the biomechanical analysis of pirouette performance. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that, Catherine. I know you're also a lecturer at Trinity Laban. You present at different conferences. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yes, a bit all over the place, most recently in London throughout this whole journey, but it's fantastic to speak with you today and share a little bit about kind of where I've been and what I've been doing.
It's so exciting to have you on. So I don't know if you just want to put in your own words as well, a little bit about your own journey through everything. So kind of where your interests took you throughout the years, what your careers look like so far.
Yeah, well, thank you for that nice welcome. So you kind of touched on a lot of that, but I think for me, I've always been dancing as long as I can remember, and always had a keen interest in research and in science. So growing up, being on the dance team and also participating in the science fairs in middle school, it's always something that's been kind of in parallel for a while. And then continuing on to my bachelor's as well, being able to kind of do a double bachelor's, which I know isn't the option everywhere in the world. So I feel very lucky that I was able to kind of study both of those passions of dance and physics. And then it was really kind of when I went over to Switzerland that I really was able to first combine those passions together, which was really exciting through my work at the University of Bern with Dr. Andrea Scherli. Biomechanics of dance, rotation, spotting, putting together all these different principles and interests, which was really fascinating and kind of started me on this journey. I've spent some time in Amsterdam where I kind of partake in my own training and my own dance practice, lots of workshops, and I work in London as a lecturer at Trinity Laban, mainly as module leader for the different research methods modules, which really kind of brings everything together, because I think through my work as a dancer and also my work as a researcher and understanding movement in practice, how can we kind of bring those things together? I love being in the lab. I love collecting data. I'm a total numbers nerd, so I love to be kind of on the analysis sides of things. So it's kind of a perfect, it brings everything together really well for me, I think, this idea of research methods. And we'll talk a little bit more about my research, I guess, as well, and trying to understand how these things all fit together. But I think what really drives that and what has kind of driven me around the world, so to speak, is really kind of my love for dance, my love for research, and kind of being able to have all these opportunities has just been absolutely fantastic. So I'm just kind of following the journey as it kind of shows itself.
Yeah, cool. I love that that's what's taking you everywhere. So let's look at your research a little bit now. So you did your master's in dance science and sports science in Switzerland, and also worked there as a research assistant. Can you tell us firstly just a bit about this research? So what was it on? What was your sort of like a little bit about the methods? What did you look at?
Yeah, of course. So what originally drew me to Switzerland was actually the research that Dr. Andrea Scherli was conducting there. Andrea is the program leader of the dance science program there in Bern, and she's has always had this very kind of keen interest in postural stability and complex tasks. So previously working with slackline and different aspects, and then moving that into more complex tasks such as rotations in dance, right? And trying to understand specifically head movements in relation to postural stability. Now, of course, a lot of research has looked at head movements in terms of postural stability, in terms of quiet stance, which would just be standing still or turning while walking. So we're really kind of diving into the most complex of the complex, right? Looking into rotation, which kind of drove this interest into the role of spotting in postural stability during rotation. And that's kind of carried us through a series of studies that have allowed us to kind of gain a little bit more of an understanding of what's going on there. So where should I start? I mean, it's a bit of a journey, but I'm happy to just share a bit of it.
Yeah, there's so much we could look at. Maybe, yeah, no, there's so many places that we could start. Why don't we look at, so if you just walk me through how it started, so where the interest came from, which you've done, and then if we talk about like kind of the key points from the research, and then as we go through that, I wonder if we can tie in a bit about research methods. So a bit about why the methods that you used are so relevant.
Yeah, so kind of with that initial interest that Andrea had already kind of started to research into, and I was really excited to join in on that project as well. Well, if you kind of look at the research question, right? So what's the role of spotting in postural stability during rotation, right? And that's something I think that's always kind of really important to think about in terms of developing a research question, right? So what I kind of encourage my students as well. So trying to understand, well, what is it exactly that I want to know about, right? So what's the thing I'm interested in which context would I like to kind of gain an understanding of this phenomena? And then the third question that I always ask myself is, well, how might I gather empirical evidence to allow me to kind of answer this question or learn a little bit more? So in our case, we weren't interested in kind of the role of spotting in performance of rotation, right? So we kind of had to specifically say, well, okay, so spotting and is quite specific in that sense. And well, what's the context exactly? Well, we're interested in rotation. Well, for the purpose of research, let's take a very kind of classical and standardized rotation. So we started with pirouettes. And then we kind of jumped on, so, okay, how might I gather empirical evidence, right, in order to understand this a little bit more? And this kind of started to build into kind of some studies that allowed us to kind of build up to a larger study towards the end, because we had to understand, well, how are we going to measure pirouette performance? How are we going to measure spotting, right? And when we're asking these kinds of questions, this relates more to this idea, specifically in terms of research, right? We always think, well, we want to have valid and reliable measures, right? So a valid measure is something that's actually measuring what you want it to measure, right? And a reliable measure is something that kind of with multiple measurements, you get similar measurements. So it's something you can really rely on as a good measure, right? So in that term, and kind of with those things in mind, the first thing we thought about, well, pirouette performance, how are we going to measure pirouette performance? I wrote a blog about this on the IADMS page there a while back, but it was quite an interesting process to go through, right? Because we know that there's so much in dance, there's so much to understand. When we say performance, what do we really mean, right? So we had to kind of understand, well, what's the perspective that we're coming from, right? So as researchers, we were looking at it from a more biomechanical perspective, right? Because we know, of course, there are aesthetic qualities, there are different psychological aspects that might be tied to a pirouette or things along that sense. So we kind of started with this understanding that we're approaching this from a biomechanical perspective. And what we did is we conducted a validation study. So what we did is we asked some dancers to perform some pirouettes in our laboratory at the University of Bern. And after they performed their turn, we asked them to rate their own performance on a scale of 1 to 10. And then similarly, as an observer, the researcher would also rate the performance of the pirouette. And then what we did is we wanted to see, well, is there a relationship actually between the biomechanical measurements that have been used to kind of quantify performance of a pirouette and how, for example, the dancer perceives their own performance and how the kind of observer perceives performance, right? Because when it comes to kind of 3D motion capture and all this fantastic technology that we have these days, You know, we can measure anything, right? We can measure how far the supporting foot moves. We can measure how high the passe is. We can measure, you know, the speed of the turn. We can measure the angle of deviation of the pelvis over the supporting foot, right? So of all of these measures, how should we as researchers kind of figure out what's the most important, what's the most relevant, right? So not only from a purely biomechanical perspective, but we also need to understand what's the individual's perception of performance, and also what's the observer's perception of performance. So what we did there is then we kind of correlated or looked for the relationship between different measures, biomechanical measures of performance, and also the dancer's perceptions and the observer's perceptions as well.
Can I ask, what biomechanical measures were there? So what ones did you decide in the end were the most relevant? So was it pelvis displacement or?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of where we started. Is we first, of course, we always look to the literature. So a fantastic thing to do, of course, is, well, we want to be standing on the shoulders of the people before us, right? We want to kind of move the research forward and kind of deepen the understanding. And what we found actually also, which is what additionally kind of encouraged this, kind of motivated this research, was that, well, a lot of different papers are using different measurements to quantify pirouette performance, right? So some of the measurements, for example, movement of the supporting foot was one. Another one was, again, deviation of the center of mass over the base of support. So the center of mass being kind of the calculated center of all the segments, which kind of from a more fundamental biomechanical perspective, center of mass over base of support is kind of how you would define balance, so to speak. For example, it's also been looked at this kind of verticality, the instantaneous axis. So if we take kind of the points on the shoulders, the pelvis, the supporting leg, the head, and draw a straight line through them, how does that kind of verticality come into play? So these were some of the things that we looked at that had been used in various papers and previous research to quantify pirouette performance. And kind of in addition to that, so with our study, we're able also to say, well, kind of which of these measurements is most valid in terms of quantifying performance, again, from the dancer perspective and also from the observer perspective. And what we found was actually, so from the observer perspective, from the outside perspective, this kind of verticality, this instantaneous axis correlated most highly with ratings of performance. Again, that we see kind of this verticality of the trunk and the supporting leg. If this was very vertical, if there was less deviation from the axis, in that sense that, you know, that there was a relationship with performance. So less of a deviation, higher performance rating. And when it comes to the dancer's perceptions, we actually found, again, this kind of deviation of the pelvis over the supporting foot, which perhaps might be something that the dancer can more intuitively sense as compared to, for example, the overall verticality of the body. So that was quite interesting as well to kind of understand slight differences. So when we first did that study with these initial results, we had just 10 dancers and just ran it as a small study. And now we are replicating that study. We have almost 50 dancers. We've combined data sets from Switzerland and the University of Bern, and also dancers in Perth, with the work that I do together with Luke Hopper at Cowan University. So we've kind of pulled together all of our pirouette data kind of to, again, look at kind of what kind of conclusions we can draw in terms of how well are we quantifying performance. And of course, this serves all sort of fantastic purposes moving forwards, and kind of how we can move forwards with the other questions. So that was one thing that we did, again, along the journey of trying to understand spotting. How does spotting influence performance? Well, we have to understand how are we going to measure performance. So that was a big chunk of work, but an important step to take, again, especially in terms of dance, where performance can mean many things.
Yeah, definitely. Was there ever, I want to ask a little bit more about the more specific spotting side in a minute, but just quickly first, was there ever like a measure where the dancers felt it went really well and the biomechanics, like as it should have been in theory, biomechanically, it didn't match up with their perception of it? Or were their perceptions usually pretty accurate of whether it was a good pirouette?
Yeah, I think kind of, again, so the kind of most fundamental understanding of balance would say center of mass over base of support, which is kind of like in a pirouette, we know that the center of mass is actually in the pelvis, right? center of mass over base of support. So it was actually quite nice to see that dancers' impressions were in line with this very standard understanding of physics in that sense.
Yeah. I think it's interesting as well that they've got that sense of their body, like they know their body so well, and that awareness that they can identify that. I think that's interesting that it does match up. So what do you do next then? So looking at spotting more specifically, what were the next steps in your research?
Yeah, so kind of in a similar way, well, okay, we had an idea of how we might measure performance in terms of pirouettes. Well, now, what aspect of spotting is most critical? So I know from my experience as a dancer, for example, teachers always say, and spot, and spot, and spot. But what is it about spotting, right? Do I need to arrive at the front faster? Do I need to stabilize my head longer? Is it the angle between my head and the shoulder? You know, what is it about spotting actually, right? What are we actually trying to instruct the dancers to do when we're telling them to spot? So of course, I have my own impressions from my own experience. And of course, many researchers in general, we have kind of experience that's encouraged us to conduct our research and kind of driven us to this. But it's important as a researcher to also have some reflexivity in trying to understand, well, this is my experience and this is maybe my impression. But sometimes it's good to kind of also separate your own judgments or experiences from the aspect itself. So this comes in terms of quantitative, qualitative research, different aspects, right? So understanding, well, this is my intuition, but I have to step back from that and try to be open-minded to kind of all aspects of what might come to light. And that's why we conducted a Delphi method study. So we conducted a Delphi method study in order to understand expert opinions on the key characteristics and key uses of spotting. The Delphi method is a nice way to kind of bring together a lot of experts for an iterative kind of rounds and rounds of surveys, right? So the first thing we do is we just ask all the experts, what are the most important characteristics of spotting? What is spotting most important for while dancers are turning, right? And we just have them brainstorm and bring up some ideas. Then we kind of bring together all those ideas from the experts, kind of condense them down to a list of points, then send it back to the experts. Okay, these are all the ideas that the group came up with. Which ones do you think are more important or less important, right? And then based on that, some analysis, we bring down kind of, okay, which of these points were the most important to this group? And then a third and final round, we send these back to the experts and we ask them to rank, okay, which of these is most important and which of these is least important, right? So it's quite involved in that sense. And the idea is you're trying to see if there's some consensus among the group, right? Is there any agreement about what's the most important value? What's the most important characteristic in that sense? So interestingly, we actually found at the end of the study, there was quite low consensus in terms of kind of what's the most important characteristic of spotting, which goes to show, of course, the complexity of the movement, the complexity of the technique. We know also that different dancers have individualistic approaches. There's sort of lots that we can unveil. But there were some really interesting findings that kind of hadn't come up in the research before. So for example, in terms of, again, standard research on head movements, would say, okay, well, head movements are important for balance, also in terms of, stabilizing the head can reduce dizziness, improve the sensory information that's coming in and things along those lines. So in terms of kind of uses for spotting, we had these similar kind of points came up in terms of for improving balance and reducing dizziness, but 3 important points came up as well that hadn't been in the literature. So one, for example, for orientation, that spotting is key for orientation, also rhythmic aspects of the turn, and also specifically for multiple rotations. So not only when dancers are doing a few turns, but it becomes more and more important when you're looking at a higher number of turns. Now, again, of course, as dancers, maybe we already kind of have this impression, but just to kind of make sure we're on the same page with kind of experts in the field. And then in terms of characteristics, it was quite interesting as well there too, because, some might say, especially from a more scientific background, that the longer you stabilize the head, perhaps the more accurate the visual and vestibular information that you're receiving, right? But it was interesting because the experts in our group, they really kind of prioritized and said that isolation of the head from the shoulders, like an isolated movement with kind of free mobility of the head, was more important somewhat than the stabilization of the head. So that was an interesting finding as well. And you can see how these sort of things might influence the way that we try to measure spotting and what the outcomes might be, again, by justifying these different ideas with experts in the field, which also have valuable experience, but how can we kind of formulate that and formalize it into different aspects that can allow us to dive deeper in research. And again, with the key idea always moving forward, that we have valid measurements that are relevant to the dance and dance science community.
Yeah, I love how you're tying in the research methods as well, because it's so helpful to understand when it's almost in a case study. Like, I'm learning so much about the different terms. Great. Can I say the experts that you had, were they dance scientists or dancers or teachers, or like a mix of all of them?
Yeah, we had a mix. So we had dance science researchers, we had professional ballet teachers, professional ballet dancers, and of course, some of those having more than one qualification within there. But it was a really, we had a group of 30 with really many, many years of experience. So it was quite interesting. One thing that I would mention that was quite interesting, so we did a post-hoc analysis, which means that kind of after we kind of conducted our research and did our analysis, we were kind of motivated to do another analysis that perhaps wasn't initially planned. So in this post-hoc analysis, we said, well, it might actually be interesting to see if there are differences between what dance science researchers are prioritizing and what kind of more practical individuals are prioritizing. And one thing that really came up that was quite interesting was this aspect of rhythm. So timing and rhythm was really important to those with more practical experience, professional ballet teachers, professional ballet dancers. And the researchers also were looking more so perhaps towards orientation, balance, dizziness, but it was really interesting to see that rhythmic aspect come up because in the research to date, there hasn't been much looking at rhythmic aspects of the head movement. So it was quite nice to kind of see that there.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting because I'm thinking back to when I did like a little bit on this at RAD, learning about it in lectures. So in one lecture, we would have science and we'd be learning about all of the dizziness and the biomechanical aspects and whether it does work to kind of stabilize, like this, what you were saying about the sensory input and whether it does have an effect on that. And then the next lecture, we would be looking at rhythm, because I remember actually a lecturer saying, and what's the purpose of spotting? And I was thinking about the one before, and then someone put their hand up and said rhythm for the dancer and it helps them turn in time. And I was like, oh my goodness, yes, like that's why. And yeah, it's just so interesting to hear more about it, and that other people obviously have those different ideas for it too. So have you got anything on the results for us as well? So a bit about what is the main impact of spotting, what kind of, I don't know.
So these kind of two studies which helped us to understand a little bit more about our performance measures, both of rotation and in terms of spotting performance specifically, kind of led us to perform a larger study, which actually ended up looking at faute turns. Because we found from the Delphi study that spotting was most important for a high number of rotations, that kind of changed the context that we were looking at actually in a meaningful way, right? So we had professional dancers in Switzerland from the Zurich Opera and from the Béjas school as well, coming in to do faute turns. And there were kind of two main things that we were interested. So first, we did kind of more of a descriptive correlational study. So again, looking at relationships. And the first thing we wanted to see, again, because we found from the Delphi study that spotting was really important for a high number of rotations. Well, we just said, well, let's just let the dancers turn as many possible fautes as they can do, right? And let's see what sort of strategies and what sort of changes in performance are happening over the turns, right? So in the one sense, we took this kind of verticality measure and let's see how that's changing over the turns. Well, what did we find? We didn't find any relationship actually. So the dancers are staying quite vertical the whole entire time, which just goes to show, yeah, dancers are fantastic. They can sustain performance really well. But then how might they be doing that? So a paper from Lott in 2019 was looking at how kind of movement in the supporting leg is valuable and predictive, perhaps even in high numbers of rotations, right? So when dancers are doing many turns in pirouettes, we actually see that they use more adjustments in the supporting foot. And we found this also in the fouettes as well. So they're using more adjustments in their supporting foot. However, they're staying very vertical. In terms of spotting, what did we see there? Well, we saw that actually towards the end of the turn, dancers stabilized their head for a slightly longer time towards the front. So they were trying towards the end of the turn to maintain their head towards the front as well. And then looking at that aspect of isolation that we talked about, right? Specifically that came from the Delphi study. We also found that dancers are using more kind of larger head shoulder angles. So they're isolating their head more from the trunk, right? In order to kind of sustain that spotting behavior. And additionally, we found that they're kind of decelerating the head towards the front a bit sharper, right? So really kind of slowing down the head towards the front a bit more sudden. And this could be quite interesting, right? Because we know as the dancers are turning, we have different factors, fatigue, dizziness. So there are changes that are happening in the spotting coordination as well. And then bringing that in together with this idea of orientation that came from the Delphi study as well was really quite interesting here, actually. So we saw that, again, just as the dancers were turning as much as possible, we saw that the dancers actually tended to under-rotate their head towards the end of the turn. So the orientation of the head wasn't fully making it to the front, but the torso was actually over-rotating. So that was quite interesting coordination to understand. And I guess a next stage to kind of go from here. So we've identified, again, remember our dancers were vertical the whole entire time. So they were super. And I think on average, we had 33 fouettes that were being performed. So this is really quite sensational, but we're able to observe these different strategies that dancers are using in order to sustain performance. And the question becomes, of course, now with a correlation, right? So we can only look at the relationship. So there's a relationship that as the number of turns increases, for example, the duration of spotting also increases. However, with a correlation, I'm sure many of you have heard the little jingle that correlation is not causation, right? So we can't say that one thing causes the other. All we can say is that there's a relationship between these two things. But it's interesting to understand. First, we just wanted to gain an understanding of, well, what are the compensation mechanisms? What are the changes of performance? And then we can perhaps look more into directionality to understand, well, which of these compensations are actually valuable and which of these perhaps are detrimental to turning, right? Because from a biomechanical perspective, spotting actually slows down the turn rate. So if we look at kind of the early studies of laws, we see that the head movement actually slows down the turn rate, right? So for example, this under rotation of the head, over rotation of the body, these techniques, these compensations, right? How are they affecting the turn? Are they helping the dancer or are they detrimental? So it's interesting to kind of understand those things. And I'll just tap on one short ending thing as well, because I should mention also, in addition to the motion capture, we also had electrooculography measures as well. So we put electrodes on the right and left side of the eye, so we could also get an objective measure of the dancer's dizziness, because when you're dizzy, or specifically when you're turning, your eyes kind of move back and forth in a way known as nystagmus, right? So we can get an objective measure of how kind of dizzy the dancer is, so to speak, and see again, how does this dizziness play into the movements as well. So we are working on that analysis as we speak in terms of the eye movements. And the last part I'll just tap on there as well is, and bringing this all together, right? So again, these are just a series of studies that we're kind of slowly inching our way to a deeper understanding. So we also wanted to look at, well, how does a visual fixation point, right? Or as dancers, we might say a spotting point, right? How does that influence, again, this balance orientation and orientation of the dancers during the turn? So we had, for example, dancers turning with a visual fixation point and dancers turning without a visual fixation point. So they're just turning in front of a white wall, or they were turning kind of with a GoPro as well. So it was interesting to see there also in terms of how performance changed over time. Again, so this time we were just looking at 12 fouette turns. But it's all fascinating. And I think what we found actually is that the dancers with a visual fixation point are able to kind of perhaps better train their compensation mechanisms, particularly in how they're moving the supporting foot. And also in terms of spotting, right? So we see that without a visual fixation point, the dancers spot longer. However, with the visual fixation point, they spot slightly less. So these are things that we can kind of look into as well. So I think in terms of kind of all these different measures and different aspects of spotting, well, what might you recommend for practice? What might we think? Well, based on the research up to this point and the analysis that we've conducted so far, it seems quite important that the dancer arrives with the spot, right? So really kind of arriving and focusing on that arriving, right? And that's where this kind of large isolation between the head and shoulder comes in, perhaps this kind of sharper stop of the head. And then once the dancer arrives, to just continue back around, right? Because again, at this stage in our research, it could be actually that the longer the spot, that this may be detrimental to the turn, because the spot actually reduces the rate of the turn, right? So if you think about it, if you're leaving the head behind too long, and then you have a larger kind of whip around of the head, this might be detrimental. So moving forward, it could really be to really focus on that arriving moment, and then the fluid isolation continuing with the torso and the trunk back around.
Okay, so when you say arrive with it, do you mean get the body around as well at the same time as the head? Is that right?
Well, I think the arrival of the head would be more so the focus for the dancer, right? So really thinking of arriving with your head in your spot or your focus, right? So really trying to arrive with the head very clearly. So focusing on that first part of the spotting, so to speak, right? So kind of, again, we use this language in dance, right? Spot, right? What do I mean? So that's why I'm trying to kind of describe it a little bit more in depth, right? But just that idea of arriving with your head at your fixation point and then just allowing the turn to continue, but really focusing on that arrival rather than thinking about leaving your head behind too long, right? And that's what we're at the moment analyzing and trying to understand, that perhaps kind of leaving the head behind for too long or stabilizing the head for too long during rotation could be disrupting the mechanics of the turn. So really to focus on arriving with a very fluid, isolated head movement, and then just to continue the turn, but really to focus on the arrival of the spot.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know, it's probably such a stretch, but I'm just thinking about when I first teach grade 2, so grade 2 ballet, I'm trying to think how old that is, quite little, like 8, 9 probably, to spot. They find it easy to do the arrival and really, really hard for me to get them to try and leave it behind. So I don't know if that's, and obviously that's the first experience they have of spotting. So I don't know if that's a natural instinct for them to maybe the arrival is natural and we almost train it out of dancers by trying to leave it behind. I know that's literally just me like
yeah, well, I think it's a little bit of both. So I'll mention two things. First, kind of again from a biomechanical perspective, are you turning that head in the same direction of rotation as the turn, or are you turning your head against the rotation of the turn, right? So when you leave the head behind, you're creating this counter movement between the head and the trunk, right? So it is a little bit counterintuitive. But there's also been a study, which I'll also add the link to as well, that, it's interesting that if you look at, so there have been studies of dancers on rotating chairs where they have the dancer spot on a chair, and then they have them not spot, for example, and they measure, again, I mentioned this electrooculography, which is an objective measure of dizziness that you can use with electrodes on the side of the eyes. And they find that when the dancers spot, they're less dizzy. Now, more recently, they did a similar study, I believe it's Kim 2014, and they looked at this with non-dancers on a rotating chair, spotting and not spotting. And for non-dancers, it doesn't make a difference. So it's quite interesting because it's really something in the practice and in the technique, right? So as you kind of mentioned, for those that are earlier on, and also a study published from our group about learning to turn. So they had a group of sports science students, some of them learning to spot with, learning to do pirouettes with spotting and without spotting, right? And it really comes down to that it is a very complicated technique, right? It's not easy to just put it in and it automatically makes the turn better, right? It's very complicated coordination. And that's what we hope that by trying to understand a little bit better, well, what do we mean by spotting exactly, right? That we're trying to kind of hopefully improve how we can instruct this complex technique as well.
We were just saying off air as well, so I'll add this in somewhere in the middle maybe of the podcast, but about, because I said figure skaters don't spot, but they obviously turn much faster, which then makes sense. But then Catherine said that gymnasts on a beam are turning triple pirouettes on a beam and also not spotting, but also not losing their balance, which is interesting. So
yeah, exactly. And I think that leads the question, well, why do dancers spot? And that's actually really what the Delphi method survey was aiming for. So we actually asked the experts 3 different questions. The first question was, why do dancers spot? And then we asked specifically about the characteristics and the uses. But again, if we look kind of from a biomechanical perspective, spotting actually slows down the turn rate. And especially, for example, if the head isn't perfectly on the vertical axis, any movement outside of the vertical axis is disruptive to the turn, right? And we see that gymnasts, for example, do turns without spotting. But as we mentioned, there are different aspects. Could it be historical? Could it be aesthetic? So for example, this has been suggested, though this never, this kind of was bumped out in our Delphi method survey in terms of, so it wasn't just historical, but it seems that there is, from the dance community side, that there is a reason that dancers spot, and that's what we're really trying to untangle. But what might be really important, again, is what came out of that Delphi method survey in terms of the results, right? It's for high number of rotations, right? We're looking at a very high number of rotations. So maybe for 2 turns, maybe maximally 3 turns, you might be able to get by. But as we're going higher and higher, especially with the different aspects that came up, right? Orientation, rhythm, different aspects that it might be contributing to as well. So that's what we're trying to untangle again. Why do dancers spot?
yeah, definitely. And I would love as well, we could stay here all day and chat about it, but something else I'm just thinking about is how important it is in comparison to what the rest of the body's doing, which I guess is what we talked about right at the start of the podcast. But I'm thinking, so if you're trying to, I don't know, like tenths and second when you change your spot, how important is the spot then, as opposed to the plie on the supporting leg or something else? Like what's the contributing factor to that would be something really interesting to.
Yeah, and I think that's what we slowly try to gain an understanding of with the different Fouette studies that we've been conducting, right? So trying to look at this very complex phenomena and look at continued performance, because exactly as you mentioned, when we're looking at changing spots or different movements and different rotations, that's really actually where it might be the most important, again, for sustaining performance, right? Not only to do one move and continue on, but how does the dancer sustain performance? How do they make compensations and adaptations? How are they gathering information that allows them to do that? Is it the visual information? Is it the orientation of the head, right? So there's a lot that can be gathered there. And again, trying to understand and pull apart these different compensation mechanisms hopefully will allow us to understand better, well, what is actually influencing performance and which compensations are most beneficial for the dancers and which ones are kind of perhaps reactions that might be detrimental to turning, right? Because we're all just trying to keep turning.
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, the whole thing, fascinating is like an understatement. Like I'm just so blown by the whole thing. It's so interesting. I'd love, when do you think you'll be finished with like the analysis of the dizziness? Because I can't wait. That's just so interesting. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, well, I mean, coming back to it, so with research in general, it's quite intensive and it takes a while. And that's something that, we have to understand as researchers and also as dancers when we're asking dancers to volunteer in our study. So, we have a dancer come in, we have to put 50 motion caption markers on them. Then we have to extract that data. We have to there is automatic marker labeling, then we have to manually correct it, then we have to filter the data. I code self-written algorithms that then try to identify key moments in Fouette turns. And so this is a very, very long process, right? So I think sometimes this process, you have an idea that, that it'll just kind of come very quickly, but it's quite involved, all stages, right? So even if you're starting, something I tell my students as well, recruiting participants, finding dancers who can come to your lab, that can take 6 weeks sometimes just to find people to come. So it's quite a long, drawn out process. So we've been working on this analysis for quite some time, and we're preparing some articles that'll soon be published. So we're really excited to kind of share all that with everyone soon.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, it's just, yeah, I bet it's probably like, to me, it's just so exciting. I'm like, I can't wait to see the results, but to go.
We're excited to share them.
So drawing sort of from this and looking at the idea of performance validation again, so dance is often about more than what can be quantified, which is what you're talking about with the different kind of methods observed, and then like the biomechanical analysis as well. How does that present challenges to research? So not necessarily just your own research, but to research in general. How is that a challenge? And maybe how can we overcome that, and how can that help translation into the studio in the future, perhaps?
Yeah, I think this is really one of the biggest challenges that we meet as dance science researchers. So how can we, again, analyze what's the phenomena that we're interested in and what sort of evidence can we gather? And I think the best thing is just to be really open-minded, and that's where this kind of breadth of methodology and different methods for data collection come in. So understanding that we have different options and how we can assess different aspects. So even something like injury, we know injury has many different dimensions. Understanding, for example, a sociological perspective of, how the dancer is within a specific company. Are they in a pre-professional school? Are they freelancing? What's their access to healthcare? What's the psychological impact? What's the dancer's kind of biomechanical way of moving? What's the kind of physiological underlying fitness of the dancer? So there's so many different perspectives actually when we come to these things. And I think that just being open-minded and also being aware that there are different layers. As researchers, of course, we focus in on one, but being aware and open to the other layers as well, I think is really important for us to maintain that kind of open-mindedness and how we can kind of progress understanding as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. So looking a little bit at your research module at Laban as well, you teach sort of you were saying last time, it's a lot about the skills that researchers will need in the field now, because it's always changing and always evolving. So what are these skills? What do you focus on and try and develop with your students?
Yeah, so I think that research methods is something, again, that I've always come to love just by doing research, right? So by understanding, okay, I need to design a study. Well, how am I going to measure that? Well, I should probably do a pilot study or a trial study. Well, let's see what the dancers think. Oh, I need to conduct a questionnaire. Oh, I need to measure some other things. So all these kind of different aspects and methods come up along the way. So it's really fantastic now. So I'm module leader for 3 different modules of research methods in the MSc MFA Dance Science program at Trinity Laban. So the first module, Approaches to Performance Research, really just looks at that overarching understanding, as I mentioned previously, of all the different methodologies and methods that we have to examine phenomena, to understand the things around us. So really providing that holistic understanding, again, from understanding different philosophical frameworks to different forms of reasoning, different methodologies, from ethnography to understand social groups or classical experiments or a case study, different methods for collecting data, from instrument measurement to questionnaires, interviews, and then of course, all the different forms of analysis. So the first module really kind of is an introduction to, well, what are all these tools that we have as researchers? Because as a researcher, I think it's most valuable to have this kind of toolbox, so to speak, of, well, oh, this question would be best suited for this sort of methodology or another methodology. So first kind of introducing the potential that we have and the different tools that we have that can help us address different research questions. The second 2 modules, Performing Research 1 and 2, are exactly what they sound like. So they're about performing research. So Performing Research 1 with a more quantitative focus, Performing Research 2 with a more qualitative focus. So in the first Performing Research 1, for example, of course, we dive into instrument measurement as kind of a method for collecting data. Very simple different things like screenings, jump analysis, using force plates or different aspects along those lines. And then of course, analysis, right? So from a quantitative sense, that's statistical analysis. So understanding, well, what do I do with all these numbers? How might I use them? What are software that can help me? So from Excel to Jamovi, how we can perform analysis on that data. So, and then for the qualitative side, same sort of thing. Well, what are the sort of methods that we can use to collect qualitative data, which is focusing on the experiences and the perceptions of individuals, right? So generally working with words, observations, things along those lines. So interviews, focus groups, systematic observation, naturalistic observation, and then the different forms of analysis that come with that, right? So thematic analysis or interpretive phenomenological analysis, grounded theory analysis, right? So there are different kind of ways that you can approach it. And I think that's the fantastic thing. It's helpful for me to think about it in this systematic way that I really love, which is this research onion of Saunders, which I've adapted a bit, right? But just trying to understand that there are kind of different steps along the way. And whatever your research question is, you can kind of peel through each layer and make a decision that best suits your project. So that's what we try to do in these three modules, really. So in the last two, it's fantastic because for the assessments, the students are conducting group research projects. So jump analysis for performing research 1, and for performing research 2, we have the students interact with collaborative projects of dancers and musicians that are happening at Trinity Laban, and try to understand from a more qualitative perspective the experience of collaboration, right, with observation and interviews, and then have the students write a lab report, do a poster presentation. How are you going to communicate your findings, right? Because communicating your findings is just as important, if not the most important part of research at all, right? How can we kind of share our understanding with the world to kind of increase what's known about a specific phenomenon? So it's been really exciting to be part of the process as this as the program was recently revalidated, and also to find out, well, what can we encourage the students to do? What opportunities can we give them? What experiences are valuable? So hopefully through that process, students kind of feel prepared to conduct research, feel prepared to understand, well, what sort of tools do I have? What sort of approaches can I take? How might I communicate my research? And all those little steps along the way, these kind of hiccups that come with actually collecting data, with recruiting participants, right? So they're all steps that we try to give students experiences with through these different modules.
Yeah, definitely. So the last thing I kind of like, just off that, the last thing I'd like to ask about is obviously the methods that you choose as you peel through your research onion and get down, they have different implications and kind of impacts both for the researcher and then the research they're carrying out, and then also for the participants. And then as a third kind of group, I guess the population that's being looked at but isn't in the research group. Does that make sense? I'm sure there's a term for that I haven't quite got, but I guess what I'm getting at is there's different implications for everyone involved. So could you just walk us through a few of those?
Yeah, sure. I think it's interesting to think about, again, so we talked about what's the phenomena you're interested in and in which context, right? So usually in research, we can't capture the whole population. So, right, if somebody says all the tap dancers, right, we can't measure every single tap dancer or interview every single tap dancer. So we use a smaller sample. That's what we would say in research, right? So you gather information from a sample of the population, just a small sample. And that's why, again, this idea of, well, what's the specific context? So if you're looking at, for example, tap dancers in the UK, right? So understanding very specifically, well, what's the culture? What's kind of the specific context of the individuals that you're looking at? Now, in terms of the research itself, the implications on the dancer, well, I think at the end of the day, it's also, it's this reciprocal relationship between the researcher and the participant, right? So, the participant generally is volunteering their time to participate in your research, whether that be coming to the laboratory to do some pirouettes or sitting down for an interview to discuss their experience in collaborative process, right? So the participant is providing you with their time. So as a researcher, we always try to be kind of open, understanding, and of course, with gratitude, right? That these individuals are allowing us to peek into their performance. And I think it goes the other way around as well. So I think it's important that whatever it is that we research in whatever capacity, I always try to provide the dancers with some information about what their contributions are actually adding to, what are the results, whether that be individualized reports of their performance, summaries of the research findings in that sense. So I guess no matter which perspective you take on, the important thing that we want to kind of hold central is that reciprocal relationship between the researcher and the participant, and how we engage with our dancers, right? I think it's really important that we have that kind of give and take, because as individuals are coming to us to allow us to do specific analysis, we also want to be able to provide them with information. And what does that mean for the population? In that sense, hopefully it comes back to this idea of communication, right? So how can we create that bridge from what we're doing? How can we communicate that to a population? This is a big challenge, right? Specifically when it comes to dance science research. But that's why different kind of ways of communication have come up that are really valuable. For example, this podcast, right? That's one way that we can reach people. Different forms of infographics, social media, conferences. There are different ways that we can kind of spread the word these days. And I think that that's really valuable.
No, for sure. Yeah, and that's why I like Saunders, I guess because I love learning about it as well, but I hope that it makes it easy for other people too as well. So that's really great. I think we've had such an in-depth conversation today, Catherine. I've loved hearing, especially about the pirouettes and spotting. I think because it's something so relevant, and I think a lot of people are quite intrigued by it and don't necessarily know all the different aspects of the theory behind it. So I'm sure that'll be so interesting. And as well, I love the way that you can link research methods in, because it just makes it so easy to understand and interesting to think about as well, and something to kind of be able to consider and analyze as well. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to mention or discuss?
I think that's it on my end. Thanks so much for having me and kind of bringing a voice to all of this research.
You're so welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks so much for listening. Tune in again next Monday. And in the meantime, follow @SciDance Podcast on Instagram. It would also be so appreciated if you have a moment, if you could please rate and review on Apple to help the podcast grow. Bye.